Let's go ahead and get started. I think if Eric shows up, we'll let everybody know that he's here. Otherwise, we'll go with the folks we have. So I, Chair Eric Sandoval, call the virtual Building Codes Structures Board meeting of February 3rd, 2021 to order at 9:35. Melissa, could you please take the roll call?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Andrew Dykeman.
Present.
Steve Forster.
Present.
Brenda Hartzog.
Present.
Jerry Heikkinen.
Here.
Randy Samuelson.
Here.
Kale Zuklag.
Zuschlag, but that's okay. Present.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Vice Chair Eric Schmidt. Chair Eric Sandoval.
Here. Thank you, Melissa. Appears we have a quorum. And everybody received the agenda item. And just wanted to know if anybody had any alterations to that agenda items. Hearing no changes, I rule the agenda and order of business approved. We also had some minutes that came out for the August 5th, 2020. And if there's any comments, we received those at this time. Hearing no comments, I, Chair Sandoval, rule the draft minutes of August 5th, 2020 final. And our next scheduled meeting will be May 5th, 2021. The remaining Structures Board meetings will be May 5th, August 4th, and November 3rd for the calendar year 2021. So we'll move on to our next section, Section 2, public comment. And in this section, we have any public comments received before the scheduled meeting, we'll address accordingly. So I request Tyler Glaze, our public policy analyst for the division, to address the public comment. Tyler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. My name is Tyler Glaze, policy analyst for the Building Codes Division. I believe we have one individual signed up for public comment, but I believe he's going to speak on the Chapter 1 update, Mr. Chair. So if you'd like to address it at that time.
Sure. Yeah, it'd be fine. We were thinking that would allow for information, but not necessarily discussion. Could you go over the guidelines for understanding public comment and whether or not there's availability for board questions, comments, and discussion?
Certainly, Mr. Chair. Normally, members or individuals who like to make public comment, generally it comes after the discussion of the board. They are usually allowed however long the chair would like to grant them for public comment, so usually 2 to 5 minutes. And then they are free to address questions as the chair sees fit from the board, and that's generally our policy.
Thanks very much, Tyler. Appreciate those boundary conditions. So with that, we'll move into reports, Section 3, and we have the structural program update and the ASHRAE 90.1 2019 update. So for the structural program update, recognize Tony Rocco, structural program chief, policy and technical services. Tony?
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. For the record, Tony Rocco with the division. Just with a brief program update here for the board. Regarding our structural program, our technical team is working on finalizing the 2019 OSSC errata. And I think I've mentioned that at prior meetings. We hope to post it sometime in the near future to our commercial structures program page, sub web page through the bcd.oregon.gov. But currently we have quite a few competing workload priorities, as you can imagine. So generally speaking, our technical team hopes to post errata no sooner than 1 year after the mandatory effective date of the code. So in this case, it's for the 19 iteration of the OSSC. And as you all know, that's been mandatory effective since January 1 of 2020. So just now over a year of mandatory effective application of that 19 OSSC. And that's really all I have for a program update for you, Mr. Chairman. And at the pleasure of the board, I can turn it over to Mark Heizer from our team for that ASHRAE update.
Just before you go into that, turn over, Tony, just open the board to any questions or comments to this update. Anybody have any questions for Tony? Having none, go ahead, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Chair Sandoval. For the record, Mark Heizer with the division, wanting to give an update on the next move to ASHRAE 90.1 2019. As a little background, just going back through the for the 2019 structural code, as we were moving into that, the division had made the decision looking at moving to, and in order to help comply with some executive orders for energy a little faster, moving to ASHRAE 90.1. We moved to using 90.1 2016 at that time for the 2019 code, knowing that the later version was coming out very soon, or the most recent one. We wanted to, in the move to ASHRAE, we were looking at faster adoption earlier than using the IECC, and which comes out 2 years later, and using code that was pre-vetted at this, at the ASHRAE level. They go through full cost analysis. They have pretty much every stakeholder represented through an ANSI process. For every change that's made to 90.1, people are able to make one, if not up to 3 rounds of public comments on it. So everyone, it is available for people to see not only what's coming, but where individual stakeholders or groups may have seen issues and wanted to see things change in 90.1. So everyone sees that well in advance. As you know, the division had said we would adopt the latest version of ASHRAE 90.1 as soon as possible, trying to begin the process within 1 year of its publication, and also making sure that we had the compliance calculator, ComCheck available, everything ready to go, making sure that the federal look at this was done. And since that did happen, we began our outreach earlier this year. We have gone through looking at the changes to 90.1, and I wanted to note that, once again, as part of this process, this board has said to move that information to the Construction Industry Energy Board. We're looking to present our ideas to them at their next meeting. For rulemaking, we have a lot of push from stakeholders who wanted this adopted actually last year, that in order for us to get it to an April beginning date and probably having a 6-month, that is our current plan, grace period, just like was done for the residential energy provisions, we need to move this forward quickly. At this point, I wanted to go over sort of some of the major changes that would be coming with 90.1 2019, just to give some background on this. One note, U.S. Department of Energy has already put up slides showing presentations on the differences between the two. They have training slides available already. We were hoping that the same group would have a more comprehensive publication on the differences between the two. But with that, what I'd like to present today are really some of the major changes we're going to be looking at. One of the first is that also in our move to 90.1, we're wanting to make sure that the energy provisions for any building code will be the same regardless of the building type. So once you're in the Oregon Structural Specialty Code, we want to have one energy code, and what we're doing is doing integration to have all residential occupancies that are covered built under the structural code be covered by the energy code. So we are doing some integration language so that multifamily 3 stories and under are integrated. As part of this, we're doing one additional improvement to 90.1, and that's doing more or less the inevitable that dwelling units get an exception for not being in the lighting energy calculation, and we're just saying that if you're going to do that exception, all of the lighting in the apartment should be high efficacy, either really good compact fluorescent or LED today. One other piece relates to that Oregon is bringing in 90.1 2019 is bringing in a reference to a new standard, ASHRAE 90.4, which has to do with data centers. And as you're aware, we have some really big ones here in the state. As part of Executive Order 17-20, we were tasked with looking at some high energy use buildings. And this is one area where we are going to look at one change to 90.4 2019 as it comes in to make it applicable to more buildings, so that if it is a new data center, it does have to comply to the latest edition of 90.4. That is the data center energy code. When you get into some of the major changes between 90.1 2019 versus 2016, blower door testing becomes really mandatory for all structures with one exception, and that would be if there's a third party that really does field verification of the air sealing of the continuous air barrier. So most structures will be going with a blower door test. There are some additional exceptions to make it easier for high-rise buildings and that are a little more difficult to test with a single blower door test. One other piece is regarding windows, or shall I say vertical fenestration. ASHRAE had a separate category for metal windows versus all other windows. They have modified their minimum prescriptive tables that they are now material agnostic. All windows need to meet a minimum U factor. The biggest outcome for our climate zones are that the U factor for fixed metal windows will be a little more restrictive than the previous code, and doors tighten up a little bit on their U factors. The mechanical sections, primary thing are really a big expansion of the equipment efficiency tables. And a lot of this is tied to federal rulemaking. It will reduce questions everyone has. There are certain types of equipment that did not fit well within the efficiency tables in 90.1 2016 and the codes we've had in the past. It's going to make it easier for people to know that they do have compliant equipment. Fewer questions for both the designers and building officials. They have changed the designation for fan efficiency to a new designation, FEI, fan efficient, versus the old fan efficiency grade. Manufacturers of fans have software that will be able to keep up with this. This is a new federal designation for federal rulemaking, so everyone's ready for that. A little bit more tightening on energy recovery. Some high-rise residential may fall in, although some in Oregon may not. They're tightening up some of those mechanical requirements for that. Lighting, as we know, they're getting the allowed lighting power per square foot is being restricted even more because LED lighting is just becoming so much better, faster than I think the codes can keep up. But one part of the lighting efficiency calculations, there will be a little more flexibility in the shape of the room to allow people who are doing calculations to still meet code, even though the required watts per square foot, or the maximum watts per square foot requirement, has dropped for a lot of space types. One other piece they have added is in the mechanical sections, they have a simplified path for buildings under 25,000 square feet. You know, so if it's a very simple building that probably won't have a DDC system, they have a simplified mechanical path. They are now creating a simplified path for lighting for buildings under 25,000 square feet, so that smaller structure, when you look at the daylighting zones and some of the controls, they have an easier way to get those buildings, due to the fact that a lot of the controls are really meant for much, much bigger buildings, and this helps those structures get through quicker. Garage lighting controls language has been updated, as well as some additional clarifying language on daylighting. We hope that, and with the training videos that USDOE has come up with, we can get lighting designers and building officials and designers, you know, to get through the daylight zone language a little easier. Moving from the 2014 code, there was Oregon specific, the daylighting zone requirements in the 2016 version of 90.1 were eye-opening for some people because they did add a second layer on top of it, and we're hoping that everybody's getting in the design community is catching up with that, but this should help those designers even more. So lastly, as part of our going to 90.1 2019, we said, you know, we really keep things simple. We tried not to have a ComCheck compliance software specifically for Oregon that could delay rollout for up to a year possibly. So the limited modifications that the division is putting forward are really bringing in a few items from the 2014 OEESC that were Oregon specific, but we didn't touch the last time around, but we feel could bring in some additional energy savings, but things that people were used to previously. There were some garage ventilation triggers, which, by the way, what Oregon had in 2014, ASHRAE 90.1 2022 are going to have. So that we're just a little ahead of the curve on that. We had a requirement for packaged equipment such as a rooftop unit or small split system through the wall unit, like a barred unit. If it was all electric, being able to have a heat pump for some of those units. And the only other pieces really we're looking at are to provide two flexible options for things that are in 90.1, dealing with controlled outlets, and some additional flexibility when it comes to the installation of vestibules. And if with that, sorry to roll all that out so fast, but I'm ready to take questions if anybody has any. Thank you, Chair.
Mark.
Sandoval.
Yes, Mark, I appreciate all the work you're doing and the work that you're doing on the ASHRAE committee, as well as the gathering up the ideas that we're having here in Oregon and making them productive for our group. I noticed on the websites that you've got the news and updates related to the 2019 adoption and some adoption process there. So obviously people can go to that site to see what you're working on. And I have looked at those transitional PowerPoint presentations from the Department of Energy, and I think you had some of those in your last presentation with the Energy Board. So appreciate that. I also, as a transition, just as a notation, that we do have Eric Schmidt on now, so we have the full board here. Eric, thanks for coming in. You might want to do an audio check here.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And then I just open up the this presentation that Mark's given to the group here and our board members. Do you have any questions or comments for Mark in anticipation? Yes, Kale, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And through the chair, Mark, is it possible to briefly explain any significant differences for data center requirements? And do you foresee that, having any sort of large impacts on the construction process?
Thank you, Chair Sandoval and members of ASHRAE. What they do is that this standard was created because they're a very, data centers are a very different animal. They're really in cooling 24/7, 365 days a year. They really are looking at the efficiency of the power distribution. That's on the power side. You've got power PDUs and so forth. They have a way of limiting the energy losses in that distribution to make sure it effectively gets to that. That's the major portion on that one. It's just under power. On the HVAC side, of course, most of the language is written around economizers, and that's the big, they're creating this. So on the HVAC side, it's getting the most efficient system for something that's really running doing some cooling even when it's down to 0 degrees outside. And they've worked on this for a lot of years of trying to come up with something that was effective. The one piece that was missing from 90.1 2019, so the actual code that we're bringing in, they never referenced which year of 90.4 was to be used. And what we're doing through our work is actually stating that it is 90.4 2019. So that's one of the major pieces we're bringing in. The other piece is that there's always a question on a data center that's in, say, the 20th floor of a 40-story building. How do you work in data center type HVAC for those? The current language in the energy code would say it's sort of optional for people. What we're putting in is if it is a new building and it's a data center, they should follow 90.4 to the latest standard. That's the intent of just all of what we're putting in right now, is that, if you're really a data center and you're building it off from the ground up, you really should be following this latest efficiency code and transitioning people to that. So that's really what we're doing as part of the division proposal.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Gail. Do you have a follow-up question, Gail, on that, or?
Do you foresee that, change in construction projects for those data centers? Right now, we see that the construction of those data centers being a pretty significant part of the economy and part of the state. Do you foresee that impacting that at all, or are these changes pretty minute where it shouldn't really heavily affect overall construction costs?
For the major data centers, they're probably going to more than exceed, simply because that's such a huge part of their operating cost, all of that energy that they're using. And also they have to buy backup generation for all of that energy. So they're doing the big major players will not be affected by this, just bringing it in. They would be doing that anyway. The issues have primarily been focused around some of there are certain companies that through the public process didn't want to fall into that category. Some of the phone companies were not even though they're running 24/7, didn't want that. So they've had a lot of back and forth. I think they've straightened out that most people can, that designers will be able to do this. The big data centers will more than do it. And we're making it so that, yes, if somebody's putting in a new data center and in the middle of a building, they don't have to use this program. They could if they wanted, but this is really to capture, as the executive order wanted us to, these big players making sure that if they're there, they'll go under this new standard. And of course, there's been lots of battles back and forth at the national level, what they settled on for 90.1 2019. The big players were at the table on that one, just to say that one.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions from the board members on the discussion related to the 2019 ASHRAE standard or the 90.4 data center standard 2019? All right, Mark. Well, again, appreciate your help and thanks very much for your organization getting this forward. And
Thank you, board. Thank you, Chair Sandoval.
okay, I'd like to go back to Chief Rocco, and he has some discussions here for some reappointments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are you moving to agenda item 4? Is that where we're at?
Well, I didn't hear you talk about the reappointment, so I'm just going back to 3 and just thinking about that reappointment of the Energy Code members. I believe you had.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there are 2 board member reappointments to their second 4-year terms. That's Mr. Gary Heikkinen and Mr. Randy Samuelson. And obviously, thank you from the division for to Gary and Randy for their continued efforts on the board.
Thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. So then with that, we'll move into communications section 4. And Tony, again, back to you on this one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Again, for the record, Tony Rocco with the division. Our division has been working over the past several years to accurately adjust and align the administrative provisions between the OSSC and the ORSC. And the purpose of this exercise is to, 1, to clarify our delegable authority primarily for the benefit of our local government partners. To 2, identify those areas outside of our delegable authority for local government partners to consider locally. And that part of it comes up quite often because, of course, we take a national model code that does not and cannot contemplate the uniqueness of Oregon. So they put a lot of tools in place there, and they do an excellent job. But we have an ongoing effort to try to clarify those and narrow that scope where necessary in Oregon. 3, clearly specify the scoping policy regarding statute and unoccupied structures. And 4, which is pretty much tied to 3, provide flexibility for local elected officials to address community-specific needs when considering unoccupied structures unrelated to the reasonable safeguards for occupants and users of buildings. So with that quick summary, I did prepare a short presentation for the board. At the pleasure of the board, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go through that now.
Yes, Tony, I appreciate that. And again, the hard work you're doing with the community to hear what is being asked of the division in regards to local municipalities, as well as to provide clarity in areas that may not be so clear in the administrative section. So appreciate you doing that and look forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully you can all see that quite well.
Looks good. Looks good here.
Okay.
I see you're streaming, yeah.
Good, thank you. All right, so a few pieces to this. So we're going to just go through these slide by slide, and if there's any point where you want to prompt me to stop and look at something a little bit more closely, please do. Or if you want to have the ability to kind of revisit portions of the presentation at the end, that's an option too.
Tony, can I just break you right there? I know I could see that. I just want to make sure that all the board members can see the presentation. If there's anyone who cannot see what Tony's providing, just let us know audibly that it's not working. Everybody's got thumbs up. Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, showing up fine for me.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the anticipated implementation date is April 1 of 2021. So just coming up here in a couple of months. Chapter 1 of the ORSC will align with the anticipated 2021 ORSC implementation date. And Chapter 1 of the OSSC, under the purview of this board, the OSSC, will be an interim amendment to the current OSSC and will replace the existing chapter in its entirety. Both chapter drafts have been shared broadly since September to hopefully provide municipalities a broader timeline to pursue any desired or necessary local adjustments. So the summary concepts, we touched on those just briefly ahead of this presentation, but there's a scoping policy element, doctrine of occupied field, delegable authority, local ordinances, utility service disconnection, stop work orders, and right of entry. And I kind of grouped those last ones together, but I'm going to cover each of these independently as we work through the presentation. So from the scoping policy standpoint, unoccupied structures and occupied buildings, that's really kind of what we're talking about here. And a portion of this is the may and the shall statements of Oregon Revised Statute 455-020 and how that determines the framework for this policy and approach. There's been a lot of discussion about that over the years. And again, we're trying to align that consistently across the OSSC and the ORSC. So under this policy and approach, reasonable safeguards for occupants and users of occupied buildings apply statewide under the state building code. Then there's deference to local policymakers regarding regulation of certain unoccupied structures, which provides flexibility and local regulatory options for each community. The scoping of Chapter 1 identifies these optional matters where regulated locally, the state building code provisions would apply. And those are reflected in your board packet in the Chapter 1 draft. In applying the doctrine of the occupied field, the intent of the legislature is presumed to be deference to local conditions, whether those conditions be urban or rural. And when the text of a preemption clause is susceptible to more than one plausible reading, the division relies on the plain reading that it establishes maximum flexibility. By drawing a distinction between the shall and the may, the legislature has provided an opportunity for local delineation based on local conditions for these certain unoccupied structures. Both the shall and the may categories fall under our division's regulatory scheme. While providing for local delineation in the may category, all work identified in either of the two ovals on the following slide must comply with the respective construction standards of the state building code. Local policymakers review local conditions, and who better to make community-specific decisions than the local policymakers? What's reasonable in Harney County, for example, may not be reasonable in the Portland metro area, for example. And only these local officials using local knowledge can pragmatically apply the reasonable test required of ORS 455-020 for unoccupied structures. So here are the ovals that we referred to on the last slide. I'll spend a little bit of time here so that everybody gets a chance to take it in as a visual. But what you see here is you see these two ovals and what we're just talking about here, the may and the shall. And both of those fall under 455-020. The may is what we were talking about regarding deference to local conditions and local policymakers. The shall apply statewide, statewide application, preempts anything locally, all of those things we know of the state building code. So within the shall, we have the reasonable safeguards for building occupants, accessibility for effective buildings, of course, occupied buildings, construction, reconstruction, alteration, and repair of buildings and dwellings as some examples. In the may, so still under 455-020, but deferred to those local communities, we have unoccupied structures such as fences, freestanding signs, freestanding flagpoles, things that those are the ones that most commonly come up. And then beyond that, what you'll see outside of both ovals are those items that are not regulated under the authority of ORS 455. So these are matters that are not delegated or delegable by our division to a local municipality. And oftentimes for some of these matters, a municipality may have very specific and clear independent authority. It would just not be through our division. A good example of that is abatements of nuisances and dangerous buildings. I mean, obviously there's a pointer in statute to that. A lot of local municipalities have a dangerous buildings ordinance. Some other ones that come into question quite frequently: demolition, good example. Construction in the public right-of-way, where we're not on a site, we're out in the public right-of-way. Floating docks, floating structures, we've covered those quite well in the past. Local seismic rehabilitation plans, again, another example where statute provides some exclusive authority to local municipalities. Delegable authority. Not all matters covered by the National Model Code fall under our division's delegable authority. And this is a commonly misunderstood piece where we get into a lot of discussions about this. You know, well, it's published in the Model Code. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that it works for Oregon. And so I think we always have to kind of keep that in the back of our head as we go through, even on the technical and scientific side of code adoption. A list of examples is provided within the scoping language to kind of capture these matters that are outside of our delegable authority. Municipalities may have independent regulatory authority over the listed matters, but it would not come from the authority delegated by the division. So they would need to determine that authority independently and not through the authority we grant them. Since any associated regulation is derived independently from the division, the provisions of the state building code are not mandatorily applicable to these matters, but may be referenced via ordinance where the community chooses to. Local ordinances. Nothing in the state building code limits a local municipality's ability to require application of its own ordinances or to enforce its own ordinances. The generalized national model code references to or other local ordinances throughout Chapter 1 have been deleted in both of the Chapter 1 drafts. The state building code is unable to somehow deem all local ordinances as legally sufficient within Chapter 1. Local ordinances, of course, should be adopted and implemented locally with necessary guidance from local legal counsel. Utility service disconnection. The division does not have delegable authority regarding the disconnection of fuel lines or utilities, even in the event of an emergency. Local municipalities may have independent local authority outside of the authority delegated by the division regarding disconnection of fuel lines and utilities. Regulated appliances governed by the state building code and covered under an active permit are absolutely subject to building official approval under the state building code. Stop work orders. The division's statutory authority regarding stop work orders is not delegable to a local municipality. Local municipalities likely have independent local authority outside of the authority delegated by the division regarding stop work orders. It is recommended to work closely with local legal counsel when determining independent local authority. Right of entry. And this is one that all the board members should be familiar with as it's published in the 2019 OSSC currently. The division does not have delegable authority regarding access or right of entry. These model provisions were removed during the publishing of the 2019 OSSC prior to October 2019. Occupied buildings that do not have a valid certificate of occupancy do not fall under the delegated authority from the division. References within the state building code that provide access and investigative authority to building officials are rescinded and are not valid. So here's a bit of a walkthrough on some of those concepts that we already covered and giving you some examples from those Chapter 1 drafts that are in your agenda board packet. The May is identified as optional local adoption matters and has been modified to clarify application in terms of associated structural building permitting. So you see the language there in 101.2.1. The intention there is that that list of matters would be exempt from building permits unless a municipality adopted an ordinance to specifically require a permit for one or more of the items. Where they are regulated locally via ordinance, the standards of the code would apply, because that was the may portion when we were looking at the oval illustration. And ultimately, when the state building code standards apply, the intention there is that the construction standards themselves will always be predictable for these matters statewide. Beyond those optional local adoption items, a list has been established in section 101.2.2.1 to clarify matters which may be published in the National Model Code, as we discussed, or are otherwise commonly questioned but fall outside of the division's statutory and delegable authority. Municipalities may have independent local authority to regulate these matters, but the division does not, and therefore cannot provide any associated guidance. So we try to be very clear in the language to bifurcate, the may category to those other matters which a local municipality may absolutely choose to follow through on locally through their independent local authority beyond what's delegated to them through our division. Here's an example of matters outside the statutory and delegable authority of the state building code. One that we already covered on the illustration. We have the local seismic rehabilitation plans. We have the abatement of nuisances and dangerous buildings, fire safety during construction. That's a pretty common one that comes up. Encroachments into the public way. Demolition, again, as we discussed. Floating structures, very common. Number 12 there, detached tents and other membrane structures erected for periods of 180 days or less. That one's been discussed quite a bit in the last few months, and that one is clearly under the fire officials' authority in our current Chapter 1 and in the Chapter 1 draft that's in front of you. Administration and implementation of NFIP, transitional housing accommodations as captured in ORS 446. And it goes on. Grading, again, very common for local municipalities to adopt Appendix J. Circling back to the local ordinance language and how that is struck, that model code language, any given local ordinance cannot be acknowledged directly by the state building code, inferring determination of legal sufficiency. New language is added to multiple sections to clarify that local ordinances are not restricted by the code. Legal sufficiency of such ordinances is exclusively determined by the local legal counsel. So here are two examples where you see that model code strikeout of or ordinances or and ordinances. And then you also see the additional language in blue where we've placed this language in multiple locations in both Chapter 1 drafts to clarify that the code is not limiting the municipality's ability to enact its own ordinances locally. Disconnection of utilities, stop work orders. Just more of an example on our walkthrough here of those items that we discussed. So you'll see these text boxes here, and we've also clarified that municipalities may have independent local authority regarding service utilities and service utility disconnection. And we tried to keep the two chapters very consistent across both the OSSC and ORSC to provide some predictability across both codes when using those. So next steps, we've already noticed a public rulemaking hearing for this. I put the hyperlink on here, but I realize in our remote capacity, the hyperlink's probably not the most helpful. But I'd be happy to send it to any board members. It is very easy to arrive at, via our Building Codes Division web page. And that's the presentation. So with that, I will go back to just my camera. And in the meantime, Mr. Chairman, I would welcome any feedback, input, discussion from the board. Thank you.
Chairman Rocco, thank you very much for the presentation and the hard work again with the communities that you've been reaching out to on this item and trying to provide clarity for the administrative sections. It's very helpful. I just have a couple of follow-up questions and then I'll turn it over to the remainder of the board. Again, this is not intended to necessarily have an answer at this time, but just two things that came up during your presentation. One of them has to do with the naming of the construction codes, which we have, Oregon Construction Specialty Code, and reflecting on some aberrations, if you will, in other states. They have created a different name for their local construction code. And so I'm just wondering, does the state have the authority to name the construction codes and therefore not delegatable to the local authority? I'm kind of forcing the question. Will it always be OSSC even though a local municipality may alter some of it? I'm just wondering if the naming of the construction codes is not delegatable to the local authority. And then the second question has to do with the reference of the standard of care. And you mentioned that some of these localized decisions could be referencing back to the OSSC, and I was just kind of thinking in my head about what that might look like. And so they might have maybe additional constraints on permitting, and they might say, the local authority might say construction to conform to the OSSC. Is a sidebar to that? So those are two things. I'm just trying to find that interface between the naming of the code and looking out for how construction documents are done so it can maintain consistency and try not to have this, OSSC except as amended by city of blah, blah. I'm just trying to find a way to make that consistent. And so that's the question related to the naming of the code and then also giving the municipality a way to leverage the OSSC. So those are two questions that I have.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I was dismissed from the meeting temporarily there, so I probably missed your questions. My apologies. I'm back now, so if you wouldn't mind just quickly summarizing those questions, I'd be happy to respond.
Sure. I apologize for your dismissal there. I'm not sure how that happened. The two questions had to do with the naming of the code and then the reference of the local municipality to OSSC. So the questions had to do with in terms of the naming of the code, does the state have the authority to name the construction codes and therefore not delegate it to local authority? And I have some background information if you want to know more about that. And the second one has to do with when a local authority does create an additional permitting, could they say something like construction to conform to the OSSC as a reference statement to that?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would like a little bit more on the question one. Question two, absolutely. As far as I understand, many local municipalities do that. And even for those optional matters, again, that are outside the division's delegable authority, it is permissible for the local municipality where they choose to refer to the construction standards, uniform construction standards of the state building code.
So it's a background statement on question number one. I appreciate the answers on the second question. There are some areas of other states that have adopted the state code, but then have some modifications to it, and they rename the construction code for that particular jurisdiction. So when we do work in those jurisdictions, we cannot name it by the name of the state code. We have to name it by the name of the municipality code. And so I'm wondering if we're going to see that kind of sense to it. And I kind of forced the question by reversing that by saying, does the state have the authority to name the construction codes and therefore not delegatable to the local authority? So the intention for me is like when we do our design documents that we can always say it's a OSSC as opposed to the city of blah, blah, blah code as adopting the OSSC. It kind of gets a little complicated with the permitting process. When we have to name a lot of different standards. It's not to dismiss the authority of the municipality, but just trying to work on the naming of it. Is the question, going back to the question, is does the state have the authority to name the construction codes and therefore not delegatable to local authority?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, my understanding that the name of the specialty codes comes directly from statute. So it's set by statute. And then as far as our codes there are applicable statewide. So the state building code would preempt local government from adopting something in conflict with the provisions of the statewide portion of the code. Now, there would also be, as there always is, municipal code items that you would need to consider as a customer or a design professional working in various jurisdictions. You know, a good example, you know, the seismic retrofit in Portland. They have a robust program there. Everybody's familiar with that, and that's in their city charter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just turn over to the board members to see if they have any additional questions or comments, discussion with the program chair, Tony.
No questions, Chair, for me. Thank you. Thank you, Tony, for the presentation and the information and the hard work on this. I know it's been a journey for sure, not only for this, but also the ORSC. So it's, I guess, you know, I'm pleased that there's consistency amongst those, both residential and the commercial side of things. So at least there's that'll help. I think that'll help in the overall administration of how we do our business each day. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Steve Forster here. I have two questions for Tony, if I may.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Hey, Tony, thank you. That was a really good presentation. I appreciate it. I think that'll be, you did a great job succinctly kind of going through the key issues that certainly many of us know have been causing a lot of questions and confusion for quite some time. So really nice job clarifying that and simplifying it. Hey, just for clarification, first question, just for clarification, is it BCD's position that the Chapter 1 amendments that are going through now, that those are administrative matters that are not subject to the Building Code Structures Board approval?
Correct. Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Forster. That's my understanding. Yeah, the administration, administrative matters are very clear in statute, not scientific and technical matters. And I could turn to Tyler here and maybe even Alana if she's still on the line, if they're able to jump in on if you need more information. But that is my understanding.
Perfect. And that's kind of my understanding as well. I just wanted to confirm that kind of on the record that that's the way that they would proceed, and specifically for the purposes of the board, confirm that the Chapter 1 amendments that are going through temporary rule will not have to come back. They're not coming back through this board for approval, correct? Once it's done through the temporary rule, or not temporary rule, once it's done through the administrative rulemaking process, it will become rule. It doesn't have to go back before this board. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, correct.
Perfect, thank you. And then the second question, or maybe more of a comment, is just one item that I didn't see listed on there that has causes quite a bit of question in application is for underground fire lines. And so I certainly would encourage BCD to consider putting that in, whether in ideally directly in the Chapter 1 amendments, or at a minimum touching on it in the presentation. I know it gets a little bit complicated. I know we've talked about it, myself and certainly some of the staff there at BCD. Tony, you may have been involved in some of those conversations, but it's certainly a point of confusion. And there's a couple different things specifically I think that need to be addressed. Is for the underground fire line when it's serving a sprinkler system, or the portion serving the FDC, or a standpipe, or private on-site hydrants. And so, again, I know it kind of gets confusing. I believe the general sort of consensus that has existed is if the building is required to have a sprinkler system, then the portion outside of the building, that underground line, serving the sprinkler, and if there's a exterior FDC required, a remote FDC, then the FDC piping and the sprinkler supply piping would be under the scope of the state codes. But if it's only serving like on-site hydrants or on-site standpipes, it would not be under the scope of the code. Again, that's just been the general consensus, but it would certainly help tremendously, I believe, in the state if that were clarified in the code. And where it particularly gets confusing then is oftentimes you have a single line that does both of those things. So you have a large building, take a big box store, you have a single fire line that serves the sprinkler system, and then it tees off and serves on-site hydrants. The building and the property is so large that it also requires those on-site hydrants. So again, I know it gets a little bit confusing, but if it's not in there, as you know, you guys are gonna, staff will get that question probably day one if it's not in there. So I don't know if you have thoughts on it that you can comment now. Would love to hear it if you do have any thoughts, certainly, and then just put that in as a comment. Thank you. That concludes my comments or questions. And Tony, I'll let you take it if you have any comments or replies.
Yeah, sure. Through the chairman. Yeah, thanks, Mr. Forrester. And that has been discussed quite a bit, you know, and I think probably we could, great feedback. And I think that's, you know, the type of feedback we're looking for as we go forward towards the public rulemaking hearing on this. And if there are necessary adjustments there, I imagine that you could, you know, provide some specific testimony to that if there was language you had in mind. And I also think there would probably be an opportunity to maybe kind of capture that more via, you know, a white paper or a technical bulletin or similar, because we've talked about it so much and because portions of it are very clearly covered under the state building code. And then, as you noted, there's all sorts of site configuration uniqueness, you know, what if scenarios that really occur out there. And I think it would be helpful to have some just technical guidance generally on that.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, if I can, one quick follow-up question, or not, one quick follow-up comment.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think maybe one thing to think about is, I think in the general advice seems, or the general consensus that has sort of existed, that on-site hydrants would not be in the scope, but you know, the sprinkler system obviously would be. The challenge that it really creates is for contractors as well as AHJs. And I think the key matter is if that on-site portion for serving hydrants or standpipes, I think really the key issue is, would that be considered a may or a shall not regulate? Because if you literally have the same line and half of that line is under the authority of the building official, and then the other half is not, that becomes pretty complicated. Fire officials and others are certainly going to want to see those lines flushed, that they have, they're installed properly, thrust blocks, all that. And so it becomes incredibly complicated, as you can imagine, if you have a single underlying contractor who's putting in all that system all at the same time, and now they have two different authorities, two different permitting entities. How are they going to pressure or test the system? So that's just something to think about, as it does get pretty complicated. It'd be very easy from a code standpoint to say, hey, that portion's not out, right? It becomes very difficult in the field if that's the case. So just some consideration. I'd be happy to work on some language for that.
Yeah, Board Member Forrester, I appreciate your comments, and obviously there's some information or experience there that really points to a better way of doing things, or a way of doing things more consistently among different municipalities. I think that we probably have other folks online that have either similar concerns or comments there, and I'm not trying to preempt that, and I'm really trying to be open to that, but I believe that the best position for those responses are going to be in the public comment. So if there's a way that you can provide the information to that public comment agenda item, that would be the way to kind of go through that. And I know that this is an opportunity here to help figure out where that's all going. I appreciate that conversation. So again, thanks very much. So it's open back up to the the rest of the board, if there's any general comments or statements you'd like to make with Tony here, if he's available and open to hearing what you're talking about. I again want to reaffirm that that was a good presentation and helps create some type of municipality clarity. Okay, hearing none, I'd like to go back to Tyler. Tyler, earlier in section 2, we mentioned that there was a public comment and it was related to the administrative chapters. So I was wondering if you could, again, clarify the role of the public comment related to the administrative chapters so I can understand more clearly how to introduce Robin into this public comment section. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Again, Tyler Glaze, policy analyst for the division. Mr. Chair, we have Robin Vora of Bend connected. If you would like to just invite him to speak and allow him whatever time limit you feel is appropriate, then he can be addressed by members of the board if they have questions, or yourself, obviously. And if there's anything else that the division can answer, we have several members of the division connected today as well.
I appreciate that, Tyler. So with that, I'd like to invite you, Robin, to provide your public comment for us so we can hear your thoughts and understand with clarity what that is. I've asked Melissa to put a timer on the comments, so we're hoping that you can provide that within a 5-minute period if that works for you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Robin Vora, Bend, Oregon. Hey, thank you for the opportunity to comment. Am I coming across okay? Sound-wise? Okay.
Yeah, good. Yep.
So I'm, just a concerned citizen. I'm not a structural engineer, don't have the technical background. It's been interesting listening to the meeting so far. So, just please take my comments in that context. I'd like to express a concern and then also just briefly address what you're talking about, local authority and local codes. And my concern came from the winter of 2017, and from the standpoint of public safety, and I still continue to be concerned about that commercial and residential building codes are insufficient to stand up to snow loads and ice dams in parts of Central Oregon during some winters. So my comments are specific to where I know Ben, but obviously, your job is to figure out how to extend that other places. I believe the snow loads in January 2017 in Central Oregon exceeded the current building code, which I was told at that time was 25 pounds per square foot. I don't know if that's correct. As I have commented before, roofs collapsed at a particle board plant, the FedEx distribution center. If the roof at Ray's food place had collapsed when there were shoppers in it, or if the roof at the Kenwood Elementary School gym that had collapsed 2 to 3 hours later, when there were kids in it, I think you would have heard from the governor, and it would have been a major crisis on the front page. Fortunately, that didn't happen, and I think at that point you would have found a way to upgrade the code immediately. Hopefully, the state has investigated those roof collapses. I haven't heard the answers, at least in the newspaper, but you may be aware of them. I think there should be a program to require monitoring snow density when snow depth in a place like Bend exceeds a foot or a foot and a half. We should err on the side of caution, and at least start with new construction. I think building codes in Bend, for what I can tell, should require roofs more similar to the codes for Sun River. Perhaps even 40 pounds per square foot. I appreciate the sections of the 2019 building code update that I think, Eric, you had sent to me. Although I have to say I didn't have time to read all the links that were included in that email, and don't have the technical expertise to understand all of it. Local building code officials, when I followed through with the county and city back in 2017, basically said they only follow state code, and they're reluctant to make their own adjustments, which each of them would then have to, document and defend. And I don't know that they all have the same level of expertise that some of you have. A lot of them seem to indicate for them, it works best is for the state to cover them with building codes. They may not, but anyway. And then I saw something about the average daily temperature in Bend, related to ice dams. It probably is the average temperature may be a little higher than that 25 degrees, but there have been years when ice dams cause backup of water. And what does it mean to say that you can have a code if there's been a history of ice dams problems? What is an adequate history? I think it should just be simple and require ice barriers and new construction in places such as Bend. It'll save thousands of people costly repairs and headaches. And back to snow loads, please don't wait for somebody to be injured or killed from a collapsed roof before upgrading the building code. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Vora. I appreciate your passion and your dedication towards public safety. This is a great venue for you to speak at, and I appreciate that you're taking the time to be concerned and to actually provide the information you have. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you as we go forward. I appreciate your honesty about the technical aspects of this and what you've said in terms of the response you've received from local jurisdictions is similar to what we just talked about earlier about the delegatable authority. So the people that you're talking to about not being able to modify things on a local level is absolutely true. Just to give you a general sense about how this has been going forward, there was a review of the snow loads again right at the same time of this particular snow event that you're talking about on the state level. So it wasn't able, the work that we did at that time wasn't able to capture the snow that was happening because it was happening at the same time that the code was being adopted. So what we did at that time was to bring up all the snow loading information through an extensive review of that on a state level. So the Structural Engineers Association, and I'm not speaking for them, but I did hear testimony during those times of the 2019 adoption that those snow loads were with the more localized information as opposed to the national code. So there was an atonement or an alignment with local information as a priority over the national requirements for snow loading. So to your point, yes, that's what the intention is of this board, and that's the intention of the SEOA, I believe, to do exactly what you're talking about doing. And our care in terms of public health, safety, and welfare is, I believe, at least similar to yours in terms of wanting to make sure people are safe and that no one is injured. I think at this point, I'd like to take your comment in and then keep that close to us as a reminder to continue on with our diligent effort to provide that public safety. And if you do need some time to talk about the technical aspects of it that provides some type of level of care, feel free to contact the BCD. And I don't want to encumber BCD with this, but I just want to make sure that what we sent you by email, that if you need some explanation, that maybe there's some staff members who could explain that. So with that general response to you, I then now open this up to the board to ask if they have any questions or comments to Mr. Vora. Appreciate again your time, Mr. Vora.
Thank you.
So again, with that wrap up, Mr. Vora, I don't have anybody here who has additional comments or questions. Hopefully it's met your need and satisfied your desire to speak to the board. Again, appreciate your efforts and look forward to future conversations with you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Vora.
You're welcome. All right. With that, then I would go back to my help sheet in terms of where we need to progress from here. I was concentrating on our dialogue. So it looks to me like that would conclude our section 4 communications. And moving on to section 5 appeals, we have none of those Section 6, unfinished business, none of that. Section 7, new business, nothing there. And Section 8, announcements, nothing there. So now I'm going to provide an adjournment. Again, we're going to meet again, proposed that meeting again time, and I believe it's May 5th, that's upcoming meeting. And with this information, there's no further business, so the meeting is adjourned at 10:45. Thanks again for all your attendance.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks,
Thanks.
Tony. Thanks, Mark.